Hello to everybody watching us on iTalk, who is live streaming us right now. Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us. We're very happy to be here today at the second pre-event for Internet Governance Forum Greece 2022. My name is Konstantina Nathanail, and on behalf of the Executive Committee of IGF Greece, I would like to welcome everybody to this event. Very happy to have seen so many people signing up and so many people joining us. It's a very interesting discussion to be having. It's a very relevant topic to be talking about, the Splinternet. I will, before I actually pass on the speaking time to the actual experts in this group, I'd like to briefly say and welcome you on behalf of the Executive Committee. IGF Greece started it's a relatively fresh initiative. It started in March 2021, and we had our first conference in November 2021, and we're now preparing for our second conference in November of this year. We are very excited to have built our own network and to start cooperating with so many amazing speakers and experts, some of whom you see with us today. If you also wish to be part of our community, either as an individual or as an organization, you can find us on all social media as IGF Greece. Yes, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We'll be more than happy to have a discussion going on there, also as part of this discussion. And also, if you want to create a cooperation with us, please feel free to reach out. Like I said, we're more than welcome to meet other individuals and organizations in the field. Finally, I would like to extend a warm welcome and a great thank you to all of our speakers joining us today. We're all very excited to see what you're going to be talking about. And a big thank you to Haris and Radamthi, who have organized this entire virtual event. With no further ado, I'd like to pass on the digital microphone to Konstantinos Komaitis, who also has really helped us to organize this event and will be moderating it as well. Konstantinos?
Thank you very much, Konstantina. So there you have the first Greek exposure to having a male and a female name that really sound very much the same. It's great to be here. I am very happy to be here. I am glad to see old friends, as well as a lot of people online from Ghana and the United States, from different parts of the world. So thank you very much for joining. I'm Konstantinos Komaitis. I will be moderating our conversation today. I really want to make this more of a conversation with our three experts, and we will be talking about Splinternet. So a little bit of context before we start, and before, of course, I introduce my friends and esteemed speakers. So perhaps one of the most complex conversations happening right now in the internet is how global the internet truly is. Is it as global as it was when it was created, or have we entered a time of fragmentation, or what is becoming commonly known as Splinternet? Going back to the origins of the internet, the global character of the internet was more of an accident, one can say, rather than a conscious design choice. The idea was that we needed a technology based on autonomous systems being able to interconnect as long as they speak one common language, and that was the internet protocol language. These systems could be anywhere in the world, but there was not really a prerequisite that they really had to be literally in every single part of the world. They just happened to be. The global character of the internet, however, has been one of its core values. In 2012, technologist and a former colleague of mine, Leslie Daigle, writing for the Internet Society, said about the internet's global character: any endpoint of the internet can address any other endpoint, and the information received at one endpoint is as intended by the sender, wherever the receiver connects to the internet. Implicit in this is the requirement of global managed addressing and naming services. So in the early days of the internet, users were experiencing the internet and they felt that it was more global. For sure, there were restrictions early on. For instance, China imposed such restrictions, but in general, there were not a lot of barriers to participation, or at least so it felt like. However, lately, the internet feels less global. things are changing, and it feels that we are entering an era, or we have entered an era, better yet, where the internet is less global. And there are a bunch of factors responsible for this: regulation, geopolitical shifts, the role of China, the rise of nationalism across the world, the increasing wave of internet shutdowns, even the war in Ukraine. And we will try to unpack a little bit some of those factors as we are discussing it. As Konstantinos said, we are having this conversation under the auspices of the Greek IGF. The Greek IGF is very young, but it comes at a time when Greece is experiencing a revolutionary digital transformation. The current government seems to be committed to all things digital and has been very successful in using digital technologies to ease bureaucracy while also attracting investment. As the internet becomes a crucial vehicle for Greece, it is important that national policymakers and other stakeholders understand the opportunities of a global network of networks and the unintended consequences a possible splinternet can have. So, with this in mind, I am very happy to introduce the people who will be having a chat with today. There are friends and former colleagues, and each one of them has spent time thinking about the idea of a splinternet through their respective roles. Milton Mueller, I'll start with you. Milton is a professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta, the United States, in the School of Public Policy and the School of Cybersecurity and Privacy. His CV is very rich and includes countless publications and professional roles, and he's one of the most actually influential voices in internet governance. Farzaneh Badii is the founder of Digital Medusa, an initiative that focuses on protecting the core values of our global digital space with sound governance through research and collective action. For the past decade, Farzaneh has undertaken research at Yale Law School, Georgia Institute of Technology, and the Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society in Berlin. And last, but certainly not least, Jane Coffin has been working at the Center of Technology, Connectivity, Policy and Regulatory Issues and the Development of the Internet since 1997. She's the current Chief Community Officer at Connect Humanity, and she was the Senior Vice President for Connectivity Issues and Development at the Internet Society. And I am Konstantinos Komaitis, and I am with the Data Governance at the New York Times. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for being here and for taking the time to speak to this young and emerging community. Let's start. And to anyone who's watching, please do share your thoughts and questions, and I will do my best to have our panelists address them. So I will start with what I know is a very loaded question, and I know that you have a lot to say, but here goes. How do you understand this idea of a splinternet? And is it a thing? I mean, is it a real issue, or are we just, is it one of those issues where everybody likes to talk about it, but it's not a real issue? Farzi, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Konstantinos. So I do believe that it is an issue, but I've been thinking about how to frame this. And the idea of a splinternet comes down to a limitation of access to various internet services and essential properties of the internet. And this is how I frame it. And and when we want to talk about it, I think that nuances really matter. When we are talking about access and lack of access to essential properties of the internet, it's something different than lack of access to certain services or content or platforms to the internet, on the internet. Because when we look at kind of like limiting access to, for example, internet protocols that in some nation states, internet protocols actually make your existence online happen. So if you revoke those IP addresses, then you just don't have you can't have an online existence. But then there are other aspects of, there are other forms of limiting access to the internet and creating this kind of splinternet, which is about not like services and properties of the internet that kind of affect your access to certain services. So I think that this kind of detail is very important, and later on I will explain how that has affected our kind of discussions and access of certain nations to these essential services and properties.
Thank you, Farzaneh. You've mentioned access, and you've mentioned access from the point of view, of the essential properties of the internet or the services of the internet, and you are referring mainly, at least in first reflection, you are referring mainly to infrastructure issues. Jane, I know that you've spent some time looking at issues of access, completely perhaps disjoined from this whole idea of Splinternet, right? However, do you consider, and let's put it out there right here, right now, do you consider that there is any connection between access, issues of access connectivity, right, and this whole idea of Splinternet? Is there any nexus that perhaps people need to start thinking about, or what have you?
I think it depends on how you define splintering. And I was thinking about the word splinter. It's up there with multi-stakeholder and how people define it, what they mean by it. A splinter, if you're looking at a piece of wood, is when a little piece comes off. And sometimes those things can get stuck in your finger if you're touching the wood, or it's a piece that's off that's a little dangerous because it's not attached to the whole. And so I was thinking about this with respect to access and with respect to governance. And Milton, this will be an interesting to hear what you think about this. There's splintering, in my opinion, on purpose. When you pull off on purpose, you fragment yourself, you take away yourself from the whole and trying to create something else. Or there's splintering due to the lack of the rules of the road with regulatory policy, investment, and a governance focus. And so you could look at access from two perspectives. We're going to splinter off. Maybe some countries have been looking at this, and we know you mentioned China. Russia's been looking at this. There are other countries in other contexts who've been looking at this as well, where they go back to the old telco model, which is country to country versus network to network, which is what the design of the internet was meant to be, is network to network, not country to country, like the old telco network. And when you have a splintering due to the lack of connectivity, that's also isolation. And so there is some fragmentation there of bringing people back to the whole. So you could look at it at this as intentional splintering and unintentional, because if you aren't bringing your communities together to be connected, the peoples in different cities at affordable and available prices, and you're not investing differently because the world has changed on how you connect people from the actual infrastructure side of the house, the building those networks. So there's intentional and unintentional. And I think you can join more people to the whole, which is what we saw during the pandemic, right? We saw that there were massive gaps. We saw that there were places where governments thought people were connected, and we realized, gosh, children are sitting in cars outside of a Taco Bell or a fast food restaurant or a library that was closed trying to get access. So how do we bring people back so there's a whole? And how do we look at what the splintering on purpose does to fragment the whole in a different way? So I'll put that out there.
Thank you very much, Jane. Certainly, you gave us a lot to think about. And I'm going to perhaps lift a little bit, pick up from where you left in terms of Splinternet. And, it really depends on how you look at it and how you define Splinternet. And I know that you, Milton, have spent quite a bit of time researching, and you have a book on the whole idea of fragmentation where you put forward this more or less the same idea, that it really depends on how you define fragmentation, and it is key in ensuring that the conversations can be fruitful, that we have a common understanding of the terms that we're using. So how do you understand this whole idea of Splinternet, and do you think it is really as big of an issue as over the past couple of years it has become?
Yes, it is a big issue. It's probably the biggest issue facing internet governance right now. The problem is the wording, as I think Jane and Farzaneh both mentioned. We're really talking about different things. We're not talking about technical fragmentation. Everybody's still using internet protocol. It is still what ties the world together technically. But what we're doing is there are deliberate decisions being made to block off services that rely on internet protocol to be delivered. And I have always framed this for many years as this conflict between networks and states, that we have fragmented territorial jurisdictions of states. And even when they're using the internet protocol, they're trying to impose a territorial control upon these services delivered over the internet, when, of course, the sort of natural tendency of global connectivity enabled by the internet is to have these services available to anybody and everywhere. And Jane also made an important distinction between what we might call voluntary or private decisions to disconnect or to block, and collective decisions made at the state level. That's an extremely important decision. So one of the reasons the internet was so revolutionary was that it privatized networking. So it said, the network is no longer some public state-owned monopoly. Anybody can be a network. Anybody can get the resources, the addressing, the domain names. That was all a private decision now. And what you have now is the reimposition, or the attempt to reimpose, certain forms of collective control on this global space created by the compatibility of the internet protocol. And you can't say that all of this blocking is bad, in the sense that if I decide that I want to put into my email filters a command that says Jane cannot send me email, that's my business. That's between Jane and me. It's not a public policy decision. But if the government decides that Jane is to be censored, and nobody, even people who want to talk to Jane via email, can talk to her anymore, that's a different order of change. That is what we would call splintering or fragmentation, or what I like to call alignment, because of the way it maps territorial jurisdictions, legal jurisdictions, onto the communication capabilities of the internet.
Thank you. So I think that all three of you are essentially saying that, sure, it is an issue. Splinternet is something that we need to discuss, that we need to be much more clear on how we define it, because the infrastructure that supports global communications will always exist, but it is what we do, how we behave towards that infrastructure, whether you're a government or a private actor, that might contribute to this idea of starting to split the internet in its individual parts. So I'm wondering,
Konstantinos, could I just intervene in there? So
sure,
I don't want to be complacent and say it will always exist, because there have been attacks on the globalized coordinating functions, right? There are people who say we shouldn't have regional transnational IP address registries. We should have national registries, or we shouldn't have global domain names. We should have nationally controlled domain names, and those administrators should follow geopolitical conflicts and maybe kick Russia out of the root, or kick whoever we don't like, out of the root. So I wouldn't assume that we are going to always have that. There are political pressures on the fundamental coordinating actions of the internet.
So let's speak a little bit about these actions. What do you think contributes to fragmentation? What are those factors that contribute to a splinternet? Farzaneh. What would be your top three, perhaps?
So I'm going to mention something that I've been focusing on. I mean, of course, there are other factors as well, but one thing is the policies that nation states come up with in order to punish other nation states, and these are like economic sanctions and geopolitical conflicts that lead to Splinternet, and the reason, and sometimes they are not even addressed, and this is very important to consider, that these policies are not internet related. They are they are not directly addressing the internet to create a Splinternet. What they are trying to do is to punish certain nation states because of their bad behavior, because they engage with war and terrorism. And but that and the US has a lot of experience with this, because the US wants to punish the bad actors, and also there are many geopolitical conflicts, and the issue of sanctions has and also when these sanction policies on the one hand, and then there are private actors that over comply with these policies, or they just don't want to bother with getting a like a waiver or a license. And also when we look at this concept of Splinternet, I think that we should pay more and more attention to other industries that the internet actually relies on to provide these services to keep people connected, like the banking sector or others, because it's their behavior as well that would prevent some of the services to be provided to people online.
Thank you. And the issue of sanctions, I think, is very interesting, and it's becoming more and more important because we literally live in times of war. And I will get back to that. But, you know, I would like to hear Milton's and Jane's perhaps top choices in terms of what causes currently, what are we seeing in 2021 and 2022, let's say, really pushing this fragmentation agenda further and further down the road. Milton.
Yes, I would say that trade, trying to achieve trade advantages, either by blocking services from foreign countries, and the merger. I would say the biggest problem is the merger of the digital economy with national security concerns. So if you think of a digital service as a threat, you know, as inherently a threat, which is the Chinese have always viewed it this way, because free expression is inimical to their one-party monopoly political system. But now you see the Europeans and the US adopting this same attitude, which is that, TikTok is dangerous. I can't say that without laughing, but this is a serious complaint among right-wing and some liberal Democrats in the US that TikTok is dangerous because the Chinese Communist Party can ask for the information about users, what they do on TikTok. Or the platforms are dangerous because they, allow all kinds of strange information into your environment. So this idea that your security is going to be protected by walling off information flows, by localizing data flows, by requiring companies to register or be licensed, or to prevent capital flows into your country because the evil foreigners are going to somehow use their ownership to take over your country. This is what I see as the main driver of what we're calling fragmentation or Splinternet.
Okay, and I would like us to get back to that, and I will try to play a little bit devil's advocate here. But Jane, please go ahead. What would be your number one thing currently causing Splinternet?
I'm going to just say three simple things: power, control, and money. I've seen that in so many places. And I can explain what that means, but it can be power over the connectivity itself, the infrastructure. As Milton was saying, sometimes it's seen in the form of security. Money, because people make money off some of these things with their equipment, create a whole new internet or a whole new thing, and you've made a lot of money for your equipment manufacturers. Or control and lack of control. When some governments start to feel through disinformation maybe, or through other collective action, that they have the lack of control over things. So those three things, and I've seen that in the international context time and time again, particularly in some of the ITU conversations, when you go into a treaty conference, that whole power, control, money comes to the front.
Okay, so I think that more or less you are all coming back to this concept of control, right? And the idea that governments around the world over the past few years in particular have grown more wary that there is this internet, and that there are a lot of things that are happening that they don't like, but also there are a lot of opportunities for them to be able and exercise some control. Let's leave the latter part on the side a little bit, because, and here is where, if most probably we had someone from the government, they would say, okay, but I hear you, and that's great. But at the same time, I have the need, the social contract I have signed with my own people, whether they're Greeks or Americans or Europeans, what have you, is that I cannot have a space where there is disinformation, where there is online terrorism, where there is, I see a lot of people smiling, but I'm trying very hard here to play the devil's advocate. So what would you say, because some of these concerns are real and are tangible, right? I mean, we can no longer disregard them on the basis that, oh, they exist in a galaxy far, far away. No, they exist in front of our screens, and maybe we are not exposed, but a lot of other people are. So what do you say to these people that they want to do the right thing, and let's give them the benefit of the doubt, they don't know how to do it, but at the same time, they feel compelled to do something to address some of those issues? Milton, I'll start with you, since you were the inspiration for this.
Okay, you're not such a bad devil after all. First of all, there are globalized multi-stakeholder methods of dealing with content moderation. So yes, you don't want the creep who shoots people to be able to live stream his murder. So you can work out ways of doing that that are transnational, cooperative, across governments. There is a consensus that those kinds of things should be blocked or shut down. And many of it is, in fact, private sector based, in the sense that the platforms themselves want to protect the value of their environments by eliminating, really content garbage, let's call it that, right? So they will do that to some extent. And I think the problem is where you get into different national standards, and in particular, as I said, the national security idea. So from China's point of view, American criticism of their political system coming from is a national security threat. And the US, again, is getting into that same mindset where we're saying that, we have to shut ourselves off from Chinese companies, even if they're really just out to make money in a trade context, simply because they're Chinese, right? So I think there's a pretty clear distinction between forms of content that are wrong and manipulative and need to be blocked, and forms that are simply disagreements. And the problem with linking those decisions about what to block to the state, as opposed to the community, the private actors, is that you tie these decisions into national security and geopolitics, rather than it being based on, what's really good for society and for the communities that are involved.
So, Farzaneh, then, I mean, do these multi-stakeholder fora that Milton mentioned in the context of content moderation work? I mean, I know that, you know, the community, and by the community, I mean the internet community, for the past 20 years, right? 20 to 25 years, has been working very hard in trying to make this multi-stakeholder governance, to legitimize it in many ways within the context of the internet, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. What about content moderation? Has it managed to offer a legitimate and comforting alternative to traditional lawmaking? So we can go back to regulators and actually say, there is a workable method here. You don't need to intervene the way you do.
I think that, so how can I say this nicely? So what, Konstantinos, of course, we have had successful multi-stakeholder models like at ICANN and various other organizations and the internet registries and stuff like places like that we can refer to, and we can learn from them. But I believe that multi-stakeholder content governance is still in infancy. We are still trying out to see if it's possible. Like if you look at the global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, it took us a long time to kind of ask them to be multi-stakeholder, and then they listened, or like, to some extent they listened, and they are kind of, but the effectiveness of GIF-CT in combating terrorism, and also like telling the regulators that, look, we are doing something effective here, you don't have to regulate us, it still remains to be seen. And the problem is that I think that multi-stakeholder content, I think that regulators want to regulate, and they think that by just removing content and taking them down, they are better they come across as like effective in the eyes of the public. So even if we tell them that, we show them that there are these multi-stakeholder content moderation initiatives, and we are doing our best, they still will not. I'm not sure they will buy that because they want to be seen as like regulators that are actually doing things and enforcing their laws in cyberspace, and they feel irrelevant. So these are, and also I wanted to add that about kind of like fighting with disinformation and stuff like that. That is good. That is good plan. But the EU especially, it says that whatever is illegal offline should be illegal online. And that, what sort of approach is that? So many things that are illegal offline should not be illegal offline. So, so I think that we are, this is not only related to the internet. I think that we are kind of like, they are in crisis for becoming like relevant and imposing their archaic laws on the internet because they want to show control.
Thanks. And just to be a little bit fair and to come to the defense a little bit of the EU, everybody says what needs to be legally offline needs to be legally online, and vice versa. I haven't heard it from, I mean, I've heard it from every single jurisdiction. Now, the EU says that, you know, the internet is like the Wild West, and I will give you that, is archaic and dated. I'll go to a question. We have a couple of questions. The first question is from Nicolas Fumarelli. and he's from the Youth IGF Uruguay. And he says, are zero rating practices also a Splinternet example? And what about unintentional BGP filterings, such as the YouTube Pakistan Telecom case? Is that also a Splinternet example? And a third one, could be also a root zone exclusion for certain CCTLD as Splinternet at some manner. So we have the question has three parts, and I love it because I feel that there is one for each one of you. I will start.
I get rowdy.
I know you will, actually. I will start with Jane and the zero rating practices that we have seen around the world, especially over, it was trending 5 years ago before the whole misinformation took us all by storm. Would you consider those being part of Splinternet? Should those be considered as a splintering practice?
It's a splintering practice, I would say, from my perspective, versus a holistic. Here's what you could access, right?
Do you want to say a little bit what zero rating is for the people that?
Well, it's I've heard so many. Why don't you give a definition? Because I've heard so many different definitions of this.
I think that in a nutshell is the idea of offering free services as part of a package, right? So you go and subscribe yourself with whoever provider you want, and in there you might have Wikipedia and Facebook and I don't know what else being part of the service without paying any sort of data. So you would consider that
that practice
Splinternet?
Yeah, actually I would, because it's to the benefit of the company who's providing that service versus the benefit of the person who can make a choice for themselves as to what sort of content they'd like. There's a plus minus here. Do you want to have people connected to the internet and using the internet and learning more and having opportunity, because there's a lot of opportunity? Or is it your job to guard against all the content? Or are you a business that's only offering a certain type of service? And do you want to, well, I would say it's up to the consumer, but the consumer would need to know what the whole scope is, right? What they could and couldn't have access to. I am working with some municipalities right now who do want to offer some free service. So I don't think that's a bad thing, right? Because I'm becoming to seeing more and more that municipalities need a role in governance, because in providing more connectivity and providing opportunity to access services, because without that opportunity, some people don't know what's out there. And for some, it's not affordable. We've let some of the private offerings take over, and they are not providing the type of connectivity that people need. They need cheaper, better, faster access, and some of them are not getting it. It's obviously what we've seen during the pandemic. But on zero rating, and I know Nicholas, hi Nicholas, I think you need to make sure consumers know what they're accessing and give them an opportunity. I don't think that zero rating practice that you were talking about was a good one, but it could have been seen by others as, okay, well then they get access somehow cheaper. Right. So it's a double-edged sword. But I feel like consumers need to be able to make choices that are informed choices, and some of those choices were not informed.
Thanks very much for that. And I think that begs also the question of, that we can touch a little bit later, pardon me, that's my dog, whether getting locked into walled gardens is also a form of Splinternet and or fragmentation. However, Milton, what about the second part of the question? And perhaps you can remind us a little bit what happened in that case, if you do remember, with YouTube in Pakistan?
Well, I think this is really an example of a broader issue of whether the fragmentation or disconnection is intentional or unintentional. So if the Pakistan regulator, if the Pakistani telecom operator makes a mistake in how they configure their router, and that deep sixes a bunch of packets and they don't get connected, that's just a mistake. That is not an example of internet fragmentation. And that's the kind of issue that really made me want to clarify this issue by writing about it, was that you can't say that every time, my Wi-Fi router goes down, the internet is fragmenting, or every time some cable, accidentally cuts a cable, oh my God, the internet is fragmenting. No, those are just mistakes and unintentional interruptions in service, but you have to have a much more systematic understanding of what splintering or fragmentation of the entire internet would be. So in the case of, the routing, I think when Egypt was undergoing their ill-fated revolution, they cut off the internet by telling their telecom operator to deliberately remove all the routes, to the rest of the world from that was a splinter. Okay. If there are hundreds of mistakes made in routing tables every day around the internet, but most of those are exactly that, mistakes, and they're not, systemic in their impact on the internet.
Thanks. And I think it is important also to say that some of these, most of these mistakes, we don't even realize as users, right? An average user would not even understand that these mistakes are happening because they're getting addressed and they're getting fixed very easily because of the way the internet was designed, right? It's agility and flexibility, and the fact that you have autonomous system being able to address those things in a more independent way is what the unique value of the internet, as opposed to a system that would be more centralized and top down, and you need to ask for authority and you need to go through whatever the appropriate venues in order to be able and address the mistake. The last part of the question, Farzaneh, is whether there could also be a root zone exclusion for certain ccTLDs in the Splinternet, and I was planning on asking it a little bit later, but I think that it's a good link to what happened a couple of months ago as part of the Russian invasion to Ukraine, and perhaps you want to give us a little bit of context. What was the request that came from the Ukrainian government, or I can mention it very briefly. The Ukrainian Digital Ministry requested from ICANN, that is the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, it is the management of the domain name system, and from one of the internet registries, that is the RIPE NCC, which is responsible for Europe and the Middle East, for the allocation of IP addresses in Europe and the Middle East. They asked essentially to each in their respective roles to do what they can in order to remove essentially Russia of the internet. And those requests were rejected. And you and I have had plenty of conversations at the time, but this sort of created an impetus for some people to start calling for sanctions against Russia. And as part of those sanctions that were given was also, let's call them internet sanctions for lack of a better term. Where do you sit on that? And what sort of Splinternet would be talking about then if that were to happen? Removal of ccTLDs or revocation of IP blocks of addresses?
So actually, it was in 2014 that there was a case against .ir, .sy, and North Korea ccTLD, I don't know which. And so the plaintiff, the plaintiff complainant had a writ of attachment because they were terrorist victims, and they had this. They wanted to get money from these terrorist states. So they thought that, okay, these ccTLDs are properties, right? They are worth something. So they went to court and they asked for the court to give them the control over that ccTLD and kind of attach it to, which was a very interesting legal case. I'm just mentioning it to say that this kind of like thinking about adding a ccTLD or removing a ccTLD from the root zone is a very like a well discussed and well litigated issue. And so in that case, I think that the U.S. court's ruling was very very insightful. And they said no, but then in the end, some of the questions about Splinternet and whether removing ccTLD from the root zone is leads to Splinternet. For me, I still have not made up my mind, and this is why I distinguish between when you take away a property or a service, access to a property or a service on the internet that is so essential that the online existence of a nation state can be endangered. So in the case of ccTLD, like .ru or a .ir, like removing them, so yes, there are like effects on their online presence, but it doesn't. They still have access to the internet. So I still. And also, like, another principle that I think we should discuss is whether there are ways in these instances, whether there are alternative ways that you can use to still have access to global internet. So, for example, if like you can use a VPN, but in IP revocation, no, you will not have access to the internet, and that's it. But in the case of removing the ccTLD from the root zone, or like kind of like blocking, and I'm not saying that this is not Splinternet, I'm just saying that we need to like kind of make these distinctions to think about it more systematically. And also like the global access. So it does affect access to the internet, to the global internet, when you remove a ccTLD from the root zone, and but when you revoke their IP addresses, they won't have access to global internet.
Awesome, thank you so very much. And it sort of goes back to this whole idea, and it's a good segue for a question that we have from Ben Avison of RIDE, which is the Regulation of AI Internet and Data Conference. And he's asking, is the splintering of the internet going to be driven primarily by A, states, geopolitics, B, technology companies through the evolution of the metaverse reliance or proprietary hardware, etc., or C, by consumers? And I saw that Milton was very quick to answer A, but I would like us to discuss whether, in using this question as the base, I want us a little bit to discuss about the way economies of scale have shaped a little bit the user experience, and whether that can be referred to as a splinternet. Meaning that, again, over the past few years, the idea of walled gardens, and that is ecosystems where, unlike the internet that is open and and everyone can participate without permission, this whole concept of permissionless innovation that has been used especially in the beginning, are really not a thing, right? Within those systems, you still can operate, but you're contractually bound by the whims of either Apple or Google or Facebook, so on and so forth. Would you consider that splinternet? Milton, are you changing your mind? Is this splinternet, or splinternet is really limited to the way states may interact by erecting borders, notional borders where their physical borders are?
Right. I think there's a lot of confusion about this issue, and I don't agree with what Jane said about, for example, the zero rating either. I think this is an issue of, these are different models. These are different business models. So saying that some kind of a private walled garden is splintering the internet, well, I would just ask you one question. Are they still using TCP/IP for connectivity? Are they still integrated at layer 3 and 4? If they are, they're not splintering the internet. They are creating a service that has a payment barrier. And so saying that these private companies are splintering the internet by having a walled garden is like saying that the New York Times is splintering the internet by requiring you to pay before you can see their newspaper. Or it may even mean, that, any kind of a service that requires you to log in like a VPN, is splintering the internet. And I think that's a fundamental confusion and abuse of words. I don't think private actors, unless you're positing some gigantic global monopoly that literally takes over the entire internet, which is not something I see as a major threat compared to states, which are monopolies of force in a territory. But yeah, if there is a global private monopoly that somehow takes over all the domains and all the IP addresses and all the services, then you could talk about them splintering the internet in some way. But until then, I think you're just talking about different business models.
Milton, however, and if I may push back, and I think that this is what Jane also, and Jane, perhaps you can take this on. It really depends on what you mean by the internet, right? And I know that, there are a lot of people out there that are having very different definitions about the internet, but from an average user perspective, right, the internet is, hopefully they see it as beyond, the Facebook or the Google, and they see the totality of it, from the technology until the content they access. Would that make any difference in the way, what do you tell to them when they feel that they cannot access those things, and they feel that there is fragmentation, or they're experiencing fragmentation, and suddenly they hear, oh, it's just a business model, but that's it. It's just an issue of business model.
Well, if you were a student in Sudan or potentially Ethiopia, and the net goes down, not because of the net itself, but because someone doesn't want you to have access to content during the exam, that is control, right? And that's government control, usually in some of those contexts, because they're ordering the networks to shut down. I'm a big fan of not shutting down any access at all. It's ridiculous, but a more appropriate term would be please avoid internet shutdowns. There's Miss Bachelet, who is from Chile, has put a lot out on Twitter recently about shutdowns, and I used to work greatly on that space. But my job is to help build networks and invest in them now. But and I take your point, Milton. I think some people think the internet is their content. They don't see it as a different layer because they're not informed enough, maybe, or they don't need to be informed. Like my mother doesn't need to know, she doesn't know what TCP/IP is. She's intellectually capable, but I'm not going to sit down and talk to her about IP addresses, ASNs, and BGP because that would make her head hurt. She was a teacher. But what she needs to know is that how to access, that she's able to access the internet on her own terms. And she's lucky because she can. And she's got access to some cheaper service sometimes. But she's got the capability. In some countries, if you are only offering the walled garden, KK, I would say no. I really am not a fan of being told what to do. So I wouldn't want to be told how I can consume information. But I also want the opportunity to choose. And I feel like I think both Farzaneh and Milton have said this, is that when governments start to jump in at a level where they're interfering with what I can do on how I access the internet, what content I can access, that really makes me uncomfortable because I feel like my civil rights are being interfered with, or my social rights. So there's a perspective there on that. There's a balance, of course, with what's offered. And this is always, Milton, some of this always devolves into security issues when you're talking about kids online and the content that children should have access to. And of course, would not want to see harm to children and with some of the content online, but how do you balance all of this out? It's a major question that's asked at every conference I've been to. What is the balance between what consumers want, what the private sector is trying to provide, and what the role of government is? And so it gets really tricky when it's a challenge on the content side.
So talking a little bit about, how people understand the internet quite differently. One of the things and one of the conversations that is currently happening, especially within the camp that sees the internet a little bit more holistically rather than just the infrastructure, is that technology currently on innovation is really not happening in the infrastructure of the internet anymore, right? It really doesn't. I mean, the BGP protocol has not been updated in gazillion years. Not that it needs to, but there's no really any innovation that has happened within the internet infrastructure. However, we're seeing more and more innovation happening, higher the stack. And it's just moving higher and higher and higher, right? Right now, we're within the app system and algorithms. So as part of that, one of the questions that we're having from one of the participants, from Ioana Nula, is, would you agree that algorithms that drive business models, which are based on over-personalization and polarization, generate a form of splintering that restricts citizens' opportunities to engage globally? In this context, can algorithms be understood as infrastructure? Which I think is a very good question. Could splintering be measured, and could governments or private actors potentially be held to account for trying to control traffic and influence or manage citizen behavior? Dun, dun, dun. That's a very big question. Milton.
Okay. Let's deal first with this distinction between what is infrastructure and what is not. So, of course, the fundamental standards that enable global connectivity are stable and don't change. And look what happens when people talk about changing them. Suddenly it's, oh my God, they're Chinese, they want to have a new IP. or it's IPv6, oh, it's great, except that it's incredibly costly to implement because everything changes and suddenly half of your software is incompatible, right? So you don't want that stuff to change. You may eventually need to upgrade those fundamental infrastructural protocols, but you shouldn't expect them to be innovating. And the whole point is that that kind of stability enables innovation at the higher levels. So, and that is indeed happening, and I think it's happening a lot. So, our algorithms infrastructure. I think algorithms has turned into like a boogeyman, right? It's like algorithms, they're going to get you, right? But what is an algorithm? And in fact, this is one of my hobby horses now. When people talk about AI as being a new technology, AI isn't a new technology. It's software. It's a software application. It just kind of uses data in a sophisticated way, but it's like, it's nothing more, categorically different than, when, the word processing tells you that a certain word is ungrammatical or misspelled, right? That's AI. That's an algorithm based on data. So, can algorithms be used to engage in systematic social mind control? This is the question you're asking, isn't it? Yes. I would say no. I would say yes. No, I'm sorry. I'm being controlled. No, never mind. Algorithms are things that can be abused, and they can be wrong, and they can be based on biased data. So it's like, but so can the non-digital algorithms, right? If you go into the driver's license, the Department of Motor Vehicles in Atlanta, and stand in line in some miserable place and get your driver's license, you're going through an algorithm. You have to do this, you have to do that. And then when that step is completed, you go over there. That's an algorithm. If the algorithm is discriminatory and bad, then you need to criticize it, you need to expose it, you need to get rid of it or change it. If the algorithm is something that says, hey, I can look at 70,000 radiology scans in 2 minutes and discover that 5 of these people have a disease that we need to take care of, that's good. So you can't really say categorically whether algorithms are good or bad or infrastructure or not. They're just software applications, really. And like all software applications, they are, they're of varying quality, varying functionality.
Okay, anyone else would like to say anything briefly? Farzaneh, I see you're unmuting yourself, so.
I mean, it's a very interesting question, but I think that we need to think more about this term that we are using. And what are we talking about here? Are we talking about like access to global internet and like blocking access to that global internet? Is that a Splinternet? If we are talking about that, then I can go and find some algorithms that, you know, kind of like do that, like block access to global internet. And I can like give you examples of, it's not only blocking, but it's kind of like also undermining the quality of service, so that you, it's on this service becomes unusable. So for example, in the issue of sanctions that I mentioned, some internet exchange points and peering organizations, they don't peer with organization with those that are in sanctioned countries. And that kind of, it also like reduces quality of service and their access of those people to the internet. So if there are like algorithms that can kind of like affect the quality of service and the properties and the essential properties of the internet, that, you know, people can't go online or they can't have access to this global internet, then yes, that's something to consider. But if, like, you know, for example, I don't know if we also like consider like when Zoom doesn't want to provide its services to some countries. And I think that what we should always ask is there an alternative to this service on the internet? Can this be done in other ways? If it can be done in other ways, then I don't think that Splinternet thing is really happening, or we need to measure it.
Thank you, Farzaneh. Jane, is there anything that you would like to add?
I would just say, from an infrastructure perspective, whether algorithms are, it can alter my ability to choose or access, as Farzaneh and Milton have said. So is it hardcore internet infrastructure? No. But is it a way to manipulate what rides on top of that infrastructure and the content? Yeah.
Okay.
Versus, you know, robots, right?
Right. Sure. So I'm going to shift a little bit the conversation back to the role that governments and state actors play in this whole idea of Splinternet. And I think that one of the first examples that we sort of allowed us to come face to face with the idea of fragmentation and what a less global internet not looks like, because we didn't feel it, but you know, how you could build a version of networking that doesn't really correspond to the way that the internet operates was China, right? We saw there a very concerted effort that didn't happen, of course, overnight. It took years, but they have managed to build a system that appears to people outside of China, at least, to give the government the opportunity to do two things. A, control the way its citizens, Chinese citizens, receive information and absorb information and even interact or consume that information. But also it allows it to use the global internet, right, for commerce, for its own benefits, for the states, you know, for the Communist Party's own benefits. And there's this oxymoron that is happening. And of course, it gives ideas, right? Milton, I'll turn to you because I know you have a lot to say about China. First of all, is China the, you know, patient zero in some ways when it comes to this idea of fragmentation in Splinternet? And do you think that if you take Europe, if you take Russia, if you take even Africa, the different levels, right, that they're all exercising control, do you feel that the ultimate goal is perhaps to replicate the way the Chinese are experiencing and promoting the idea of the internet?
Excellent question, KK. I think that's kind of hits the nail on the head, is that China has occupied the extreme space of what I call alignment, or some people call fragmentation, which is not really fragmentation in the sense that they're cutting themselves off from the internet. As you say, they are very much invested in maintaining certain forms of global connectivity, but they don't want the information environment to be free and open. They want the government to control particularly political forms of speech, but they also have imposed, the territorialization of data. So these regulations that they have imposed on cloud service providers, the data localization requirements, the so-called cybersecurity reviews. This is all about shielding them from unwanted foreign information at the national level and preventing information going out that they don't want to go out. And I've often had this question when I've been talking to some of the people who are really radically against the big platforms, particularly Facebook. I really get the sense that what they want is something like the Chinese system of regulation of platforms, which is, I don't know, an example is they said, okay, we're going to limit the amount of time that kids can play games, and that we're going to do this nationally through a compulsory regulation. It didn't work, but it's an example of the top-down authoritarian model of controlling what people see and what people get on the internet, and they do this through business regulation.
So thank you very much for this, and I think that it paints a very clear picture. And I'm just going to bring one word, and I would expect the reaction from both Farzaneh and Jane, and that is RUNET, right? Which, for those of you who are listening and you're perhaps not familiar with the term, is the Russian version of the internet. And again, we have seen, especially in the past couple of years, big proclamations from Russia saying that, not only do we have a new law, but we also have the capabilities of disconnecting from the internet. And this became a thing, especially in the beginning of the war, whether Russia actually has the capabilities of disconnecting from the internet and being able to detach itself from the global network, meaning that we wouldn't have visibility, right? In many ways, what is happening within Russia, with everything that comes. Is that the case, Farzaneh? I know that you've spent a little bit of time thinking about it. Is that the case? Did Russia actually, has Russia the capabilities of disconnecting itself from the global network, whether these are technical or otherwise, and have they done that, to your knowledge, of course?
No. In the beginning, there were all these kind of speculations and a lot of pieces of news that were not accurate. And so unfortunately, because it is an erratic actor, right? You don't know what they're going to do. So basically, whatever kind of like policy decision they would take about, I think one case was about like something with their CCTLD and people were like, oh, that's it. They're going to limit access. What they are doing is, and they don't have the technical capability. Fortunately, Russian internet was developed by various private network operators, and Russia cannot afford at the moment. And they've been talking about this for so many years. And they came up with a law, but they have not been able to do that. But of course, with all these sanction policies and things that the outside world wants to do to Russia to teach them a lesson, that will make their life and work easier to make internet localized. It legitimizes their, like they say that, look, they imposed all these sanctions, and look, your internet access is now is going to be hampered. So we better have this local internet. And I think that that route, that going that route will expedite Russia's internet localization, and these authoritarian approaches like get more legitimized whenever the West makes these haphazard, very quick decisions to punish these governments, like it happens in Iran all the time.
So I think, yes, thank you very much for this, Farzaneh. This is spot on. And at the same time, one of the things that, creates the difficulty for Russia to actually walk the walk in many ways is that, unlike the Chinese that have early on foreseen the possibility, and they've tried to minimize as much as they could the interdependencies that exist, Russia hasn't managed to do that, right? So a lot of its content, for instance, lives on servers outside of Russia. There is also, there is not a lot of Russian content, so it can really create one sustainable RUNET. But Jane, back in the day, and I'm not going to mention the day, I promise, you were in that region and you spent some time in that region, right? And you were working towards liberalizing telecommunications at the time, and how to create a much more competitive market for telecom services, and then also for any network services. Do you think that Russia is headed, from what you had experienced at the time, and of course the world is very different right now, but the culture in these countries remains the same. Do you believe that Russia is actually working towards and has the capability of, at some point down the road, splitting itself from the internet and perhaps even replicating what China has done?
Sure, if they had enough money to throw at it and control. But I think, as Farzaneh was saying, it might be too late. There are so many brilliant technologists from Russia. They can find ways around some of the systems. Also, I would just say the word VSAT. A lot of people don't know what they are. They're very small aperture terminal satellites. You put one on your embassy rooftop and you can pull down content and push out content. You don't have to connect to the local infrastructure. There are VSATs all over the world. They're often brought in by Télécoms Sans Frontières when there's a disaster to rebuild the internet and or connectivity, shall we say, so you can access content. But I think if they wanted to, they could put their minds to it. They could try, but they're not going to pull themselves out of as the roots on file, as Farzaneh had mentioned earlier. It'd be ridiculous to do that. And if they wanted to create, I think they'd have to be like on the net and off the net at the same time, the intranet, right? That's a telco term, off net and on net, but it would be a disadvantage to their businesses as well. So I think at some point in time, something would take over where it's not economically a smart thing for them to do. But could they do it? Technically, sure, they could try. But I don't think even China has different ways of, well, I won't get into it, but I think they wouldn't be wise to do that, I don't think. And we've seen, as far as you said, they haven't managed to do it so far, but they've managed to create what I would call institutional fragmentation, right? And it's something with governments where I'm looking at this from a different perspective too, and I'll throw this out. There's the intentional institutional fragmentation to try and create a separate net for themselves. But they do realize from a business perspective, and if you're going to monitor the heck out of people, which the government there often does, why would you want to get off the internet? I mean, you'd want to have more access. But there are ways that you can create institutional fragmentation by maintaining your old rules and regulations, your old sanctions regimes, right? I'm looking at things in the United States right now, and there is institutional fragmentation. There's institutional exclusion of certain rural, remote, and urban communities due to the way the rules are currently in place and not allowing in other alternative connectivity mechanisms, whether those are municipal networks, community networks, or whatever you want to call them, providing connectivity to people who need it the most at affordable prices. And by keeping those old rules, regs in place, you are institutionally excluding and creating a less whole internet. And there is fragmentation in the sense, I don't know if you call it fragmentation, there's exclusion, right? And so I would say there's purposeful, and then there's now, what do you do to change it in more developed internet economies and developed infrastructures? I know that kind of screws things up, but I just want to throw that out there that
no.
Even the US is doing this, and it is acute. Yeah.
That's very helpful. So then it sounds like a lot of fragmentation, and I think that you all agree on that point, is driven by political purposes. And there is a question from Lavis Mensa that literally asks, if that's the case, will we not consider all these acts as a form of Cold War? Are we back there? And is the internet in the middle of all this? Quick reactions, because we have literally 14 minutes and I have another couple of questions that I would like to go through. So are we experiencing some form of Cold War? And if you know me, I'm not big on these analogies, but it is a really interesting question, especially if you say, are we experiencing a Cold War, and is the internet in the middle of that? I see Jay nodding. Milton, quick reaction.
Yes, I think the U.S.-China thing is an incipient Cold War, literally framed as such. If you look at the way the U.S. political dialogue about China is being framed, it is the enemy. It is we are in competition with it, just as we were with the Soviet Union. We are threatened by it and by interactions with it. So, and we're not at war, and hopefully never will be, but so it is a Cold War in that sense, that we are engaged in some kind of geopolitical competition and conflict without actually being in a military conflict. Yeah, and the internet is very much at the center of that. From the 5G Huawei thing all the way to cutting off their service providers in the US and kicking them out, taking away their licenses, and China doing the same thing with the cloud service providers. So, yeah.
Okay. Farzaneh?
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that, I'm not so sure I understand Cold War. I have read books about it, but what I think that happens is kind of like this scare of all foreign infiltration of our democracy and cyber doomsday, and everything is like gonna collapse. And Trump was elected by Russia, by the way, and that's because of the internet. I went to State of the Net in 2018, and I thought,
which is what, Farzaneh? Please explain what State of the Net is.
It's a conference that it happens in DC, and and Trump had been elected, and everybody. It was 2017, yes. So, and everybody was just riled up, and the things that they were saying just reminded me of all the propaganda that the mullahs and ayatollahs in the beginning of the revolution, and they're continuously doing it, were like repeating that these are the foreign power that are trying to steal our election and kill our democracy. But this time, whose fault is it? It's the internet, obviously. Yeah, and this is also, yes, we are definitely in the middle, and this is kind of like, and I have a better understanding because I saw it with satellite dishes and all that when it happened back in Iran, and yeah, there was another point, but I think I talked a lot, so go ahead, ask your other questions.
Yeah, I think that I might need, one of the things that I keep on repeating, and it seems not to register, but I keep on literally tweeting the same thing, is that you cannot address societal issues through technical fixes. I think I need to add, you cannot address societal or political issues through technical fixes, because, the amount of times that we have heard the internet is responsible for everything that is going on on literally in the world is quite remarkable. Or the belief that if you address, or if you fix things on the internet, magically everything else will also get fixed. I think that we have one question which I think is really spot on, especially to all three of you, and especially Milton and Farzaneh, that look at Splinternet from this very much infrastructure perspective. And the question is as follows. IoT has some legs out of the internet where 6LoWPAN and RPL work, but they're not inside the TCP IP. Essentially, one of the things that we know is for IoT to connect, you need black boxes, and it doesn't, the TCP IP protocol is not enough. This is more or less the justification that also the Chinese used before the International Telecommunications Union, which is a UN body, to promote this new idea of new IP, right? The new IP protocol. And for those of you who are listening in and you're not very familiar, in a nutshell, a couple of years ago, it might be more or might be less. We went through a pandemic, so I'm a little bit hazy on things. They put forward through Huawei, sponsored by the Chinese government, they put forward a proposal before the ITU standardization body that was essentially saying that, there is an array of new technologies emerging, quantum and IoT and what have you, that TCP/IP, the TCP/IP protocol, which is the basis for the internet, cannot support. Therefore, we need a new protocol, and let's discuss this protocol, which will be very different from the current one, by the way. It's not going to be decentralized, it's going to be centralized, but it's going to come with security and privacy and all these wonderful words that they're using. But let's discuss it within the UN. How valid do you consider this justification? Either the one that the Chinese used or here in the context of IoT, which is a very concrete example, and is this Splinternet?
Well, I think the fact that internet protocol will not be suitable for certain cyber physical applications, such as autonomous vehicles, this does in fact create an opportunity for new standards. Frankly, I was surprised that when we standardized 5G, that it continued to rely on TCP/IP. I was very surprised by that. I thought if the telcos really want to get out of the internet world, and this was their opportunity, and they did the opposite. They went to TCP/IP, which in many ways is a good thing. But it's simply the fact that there will have to be standards innovations in the cyber physical realm. And so again, I hope this does not get geopoliticized and that we say that a Chinese company is trying to take over the world for the Chinese Communist Party because they're proposing a new standard for IoT. Let them propose their standard, let the world see how good it is, let it compete in the market for adoption. But we're not headed in that direction. We're more in the Cold War direction, don't you think?
Yes, and I think that you're raising a very important point here that often goes missed, that a lot of those standards that are created through open and multi-stakeholder and bottom-up processes, not all of them are adopted, right? They're just thrown into the market, and then the market decides which are useful, which ones are useful, which ones are less useful, which ones are good, and so on and so forth. When it comes to this conversation about the new IP, we don't even let that happen, right? There is this fear that anything that might come from a certain actor and is thrown into the market is going to be imposed top down. Farzaneh, do you see this? Do you feel that this is the case? And do you see any danger in how IP behaves vis-a-vis new technologies, and also whether, the standards coming out of the ITU are necessarily to be, doomed, and we need to start literally running for the hills?
Well, my love for nation states any one of them, but I think that we are dealing with a very tricky and dangerous issue here, which is we kind of like going out of our way from the neutrality and from kind of like non-discrimination based these principles that we had at the IETF, at other standard setting organizations, that just because you're Chinese or a Chinese company, the standard that you come up with doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad standard. It's open, and kind of like now we have started bashing that kind of neutrality stance that actually made the internet work. And we discriminate against people because of their nationality, and this is going to be bad for the internet. It's going to be bad for any standard setting organizations. Like, for example, I remember that they removed editors of a standard setting organization because he was Chinese. That is the reason, and this is going to like keep happening, and I think it's going to affect the global nature of the internet, and I still think that the internet is global, and I think that it's going. And for example, for the IT, if something is coming out of ITU, what my problem is with their processes, and that they are not inclusive. And but if they have like an inclusive process, and that non-state actors can also participate, then that's great. My problem is not with like whether this is Chinese or Iranian. My problem with their processes.
Okay, thanks for that. That was clear. Jane, you were in Kigali, and that was the world, well, the WT, was it the TSA or the TDC? TDC, right?
TDC.
The development
conference
was taking place, and the new IPv6 Plus, which is, the rebranding of the new IP popped up. The African region will be key in how this plays out and where this plays out in some ways, right? What was your perception of things being there? How do people in Africa react to the possibility of actually conducting some of these discussions within spaces where they seem to be able to participate more actively rather than in other ones?
It was the regional internet registries were there, the RARs, many of them were at the meeting. And so particularly Afrinic and staff who had been at Afrinic, who are part of the ITU staff now, like specifically a good colleague who runs the African Bureau for the ITU, used to be one of the key figures in the Afrinic leadership. So you have a lot of education going on across the continent from Afrinic, from ISOC, from others. And from ICANN. You do need that information disseminated more broadly, because you don't want the governments, I think as Milton and Farzaneh were both saying, making decisions about the protocols when it's core internet infrastructure that you're talking about. There is a deep need for more information to be exchanged, but I actually think that the people saw that the contribution into the meeting was a red herring. It was to create a possibility for horse trading or for negotiation. And so there are a couple things like this. And sometimes you look at these and think, gosh, is this really, because Huawei wouldn't want to put this into the development conference right now because there's no normative standard coming out of the development conference. Right. It's not a legal, it's not a treaty making conference. It's really more about awareness and information and education and capacity development and making statements as governments about good things and sometimes bad, or what we might perceive to be tricky. But this was more about a feint, if you will, or a way to just divert attention. It did get everyone's attention, but it wasn't as much of the showstopper as I thought it would be at the meeting. And it was, I think this is thanks to an education campaign that I've seen take place for the last 15 years by the regional internet registries. And I think it goes to how to embrace bottom-up governance of the internet and the standards without trying for top-down control.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So we're literally on time, but if I just may ask literally for 30 seconds of what would be, if you had the magic wand, what would be the one thing that you would ensure does not happen that would contribute to Splinternet? 30 seconds. Milton.
The Digital Markets Act.
Okay. Okay.
That's probably not a very good choice.
What's
that?
By the way, just passed the Parliament, the European Parliament voted it in favor overwhelmingly today. So we have a law in Europe officially. Thanks. Farzaneh.
I would convince the governments to leave us alone so that we govern the internet in a multi-stakeholder or some other way, and not just all the time come up with bad regulations.
Okay, thank you. And Yanis agrees.
The dog likes that.
The dog really likes that, Farzaneh.
Those kilos too. I would say no more shutdowns, build more net.
Awesome. I think that this is a great way to end this conversation. No more shutdowns. Thank you all so very much. No more Splinternet, no more fragmentation. Milton, Farzaneh, Jane, always a pleasure to have a chat with you about things. To Haralambos, Rodanthi, Konstantina, Panagiotis, and everyone else who helped put this thing together. Thank you so very much. And to everyone who tuned in, thank you very much for asking questions and for participating. And see you all in cyberspace.
Thank you.
Care.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ.
Bye.
Bye.